So good morning, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you to the NMC On the Horizon competition from New Models of Learning. The NMC On the Horizon series reflects the research and work of the Horizon Project in action. In these Google Hangouts on air, we convene a panel of experts across all education disciplines to address the challenges, trends, and tech topics poised to significantly impact teaching and learning. As Bryan mentioned, today we tackle a challenge found in our Horizon Report series, Competition from New Models of Learning. New models of education are bringing unprecedented competition to the traditional models of education. Across the board, institutions are looking for ways to provide a high quality of service and more learning opportunities. Advancements in areas such as online learning and open content are challenging formal and informal institutions to rethink their paradigms to make them more relevant and more easily accessible. I am your host today, Alex Freeman, Director of Special Projects at the NMC. I will also be helping on tech support, so you can drop me an email at alex@nmc.org or ask a question via the Q&A if you encounter any technical problems. Sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the following discussion. But first, a bit of logistics. In this session, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A. And also +1 a question that you're interested in having answered. I will collect your questions throughout the session and try to weave them in, feed them to Bryan to see if we can have the panelists answer them. At the NMC we tweet, and when we do things Horizon Report related, we use the hashtag NMCHZ. That's hashtag NMCHZ. Now on to the moderator of today's event. Bryan Alexander is a new member of the NMC team. He's now the NMC Senior Research Associate, and he's also an educator, futurist, speaker, writer, and founder of Bryan Alexander Consulting, LLC. If you're lucky, you get his blog posts into your email boxes on a weekly basis. I enjoy seeing Bryan's take on technology and popular culture, and especially the most recent one on Interstellar. I thought that was a mind blower right there. With that introduction, I want to turn it over to Bryan.
Oh, thank you, Alex. And let me just send you a virtual round of applause for your manful wrestling of that problem to the ground. You did that with aplomb and coolness, and not to mention skill. Let me just welcome speaking of cool, let me just welcome our very cool and brilliant panel. We have 4 folks for you today who are going to wrestle this problem to the ground. We have I wouldn't say from left to right, but it's not quite right. So just imagine across your panel, we have Rebecca Griffiths, Program Director for Online Learning, Ithaca S&R. We have Will Richardson, International Speaker, Author, Publisher of Educating Modern Learners. We also have Deborah Howes, Director of Digital Learning at the Museum of Modern Art. And we have Cathy DeRosa, Vice President for the Americas and Global Vice President of Marketing for OCLC. Welcome, everyone. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask the whole panel a question which will hopefully provoke them into some discussion. So we'll give each person a chance to explain what their thinking is. And then we'll work in questions and comments that come in from you, either via the chat box or via Twitter. Now we have 4 major questions lined up, and I think 4 by 4 panelists, we should have a pretty solid discussion. If you have any questions logistically or comments, feed them in via Twitter or the chat box. But in the meantime, we'll start off. And I'll introduce each one of you by answering this question. And here's the first one. I'd like you to consider what this challenge looks like in your specific environment. Each of you has a different slice of the education pie. And if we could start off with, let me grab Rebecca. And let me just say a few words about Rebecca. She oversees online learning program for Ithaca S&R. She recently led a large-scale effort to explore the benefits and challenges associated with embedding MOOCs in campus-based courses. She's worked in higher ed for over a decade, examining issues such as sustainability of online education resources, uses of open-source software in higher education, and university publishing in the digital age. Prior to joining Ithaca, she worked in management consulting in several tech and media companies, primarily in Asia and Europe. She has degrees from 2 schools you may have heard of, MIT and Princeton University. Welcome, Rebecca, and why don't you take a shot at this great question. What do alternatives and challenges to the model look like from your environment?
Thank you, Bryan, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. I just wanted to say that I'm joining this conference, this convening live from a another convening, which is specifically focused at academic transformation in higher education, which is why I have this sort of weird conference room setting behind me. So apologies for that. I will speak to this question from the perspective of traditional institutions in higher education. These are the partners that we work with at Ithaca in our mission to help these partners to harness information technology in transformative ways. And we work both on the scholarly communication side, looking at the creation and dissemination of new knowledge, and on the teaching and learning side, and that's my primary focus. We come at this challenge from a particular direction, which is, we've seen the MOOCs erupt on the scene. These were produced by institutions of higher education, many that we've worked with, and grabbed people's attention because they suggested this possibility of being able to educate thousands of people simultaneously with almost no marginal cost. And this spoke directly to one of the key challenges our partners face, which is how to do more with less. As you alluded to earlier, we're in a very constrained budgetary environment, so this is a challenge that nearly all institutions are facing. But as MOOCs got off the ground or started gaining attention, it quickly became clear that the people who were benefiting from them the most were not traditional university students, were not mainstream undergraduates. They are great for lifelong learners. We saw students in developing countries who don't have access to higher education taking advantage of these. We saw very few students who are undergraduates taking advantage of these resources. So we asked the question of how MOOCs and MOOC-like content, how online educational resources could benefit students and the faculty who teach them in traditional environments. And that was what our study really tried to look at.
That's excellent. I really appreciate your focus on both traditional institutions as well as the question of how to expand access, how to do more with less. And your research into the audiences MOOC serve is especially important. Perhaps blended learning is the way forward, combining MOOCs with traditional institutions.
Mm-hmm. That's really what we're looking at, because in our research we have found that students really value the relationships that they have with faculty members, and they really cherish the time they have with them. They need that personal attention and support. They need to feel that somebody cares about their learning, and so we're trying to figure out how to take advantage of the online resources in order to allow faculty to free up some of the time that they spent delivering the same lectures or the same content over and over, but to really focus on these relationships and on the instructional part of the relationships they have with students.
Do you think that as the technology advances and as people get more and more comfortable with technology, do you think students will value the ability to have those relationships online?
Absolutely. Students, we always hear that the online courses fill up first, the hybrid courses fill up first. One of the challenges our partners in traditional institutions struggle with is that the undergraduate population looks very different now than it did 20 years ago. Our mental image of an undergraduate student being an 18 to 22-year-old who lives on campus and is supported by a family back at home represents a small minority of college students these days. And so our partners are trying to figure out how to meet the needs of a much more diverse set of undergraduates who have more complicated personal lives. And so being able to have part of their educational experience online makes a huge difference to a lot of students.
I wonder if that also speaks to American institutions' ability to offer student life, everything from counseling to athletics to RAs and all of that. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Let's put this on the table for traditional higher education, colleges and universities engaged in research and teaching. Let's complement that with K through 12. And to do that, we have Will Richardson. Let me introduce Will. He's a parent of 2 teenagers, hence the white hair. that you can see. He spent the last dozen years developing international reputation as a leading thinker and writer about the intersection of social online learning networks and education. He's authored 4 books somehow on the same time. Most recently, Why School? How Education Must Change When Learning and Information Are Everywhere, published by TED Books. Why School is now the #1 best-selling TED book ever. In fact, his books have sold over 150,000 copies worldwide. A former public school educator in New Jersey for 22 years, Will is also co-founder of Modern Learning Media and co-publisher of modernlearners.com. So, Will, let me welcome you and then ask what you think from your point of view, from your perspective. What do these challenges look like?
Well, first, let me say it's good to see you again, Bryan, and thanks for having me today. Really appreciate it. I think it's a little bit of a different perspective down here on the kind of K through 12 level, and certainly speaking as a parent too. The world looks a lot different today than it did even 10 years ago when we start talking about not just a higher education, but also the ability of my kids to learn on the K through 12 level. I think that for me, most of my thinking and kind of trying to, the big questions I have are around, what happens with access? What happens when my kids all of a sudden live in a world where they can learn pretty much anything they want to learn, when they want to learn it, with whomever they want to learn it? And I think what the web has done is that it's afforded this new freedom to learn that is pushing back against what you could, I think, make an argument is a lack of freedom in schools to learn around the things that kids most care about. And, I kind of get why we've done it the way we've done it when we lived in a world where we didn't have access, where we weren't able to learn as easily as we can now. But I look at my own kids' experience right now, and I see a lot of disengagement because they are pretty much being told what to learn, when to learn, and how to learn it. And that just flies in the face of their ability to learn outside of school. So I think that, when we talk about competing models, I think that one of the models is this very unstructured, highly informal learning that we're all able to do right now. And as I look at my own kids, my questions are more around, are they able to develop their own curriculum? Are they able to find their own teachers? Are they able to construct their own classrooms, ask really good questions, find the mentors and the experts that they need to help them answer those questions? But in the process of doing that, are they learning how to learn about whatever it is that they need to learn about in their lives? And that's a different question from the one that I think is being asked by schools right now at every level. It's not to discount the need for expertise, and it's not to discount the value of some form of a traditional education, but it is to say now that I think that there's this kind of huge dissonance that has been created between the way that we learn in the building and outside of the building. And I think that on just about every level, that's going to be a continuing challenge for schools as institutions to try to figure out, how do we make sure that we are giving our students the freedoms that they need to learn deeply, and yet how do we kind of balance the knowledge and the information and experiences that we feel, especially on the K through 12 level, that every child needs to be a participant in this society and our democracy. All those things that public schools have been chartered to do from the very beginning. That
public mission of universal equity, if you will.
I think that's the number one question that people have when I start, kind of talking about this abundance piece is, well, then what is the common piece of this? What is it that, if we're going to say that we're going to give children more freedom to learn around the things that they care about, doesn't there have to be some bucket? Doesn't there have to be some common knowledge, common experience? I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I like to, quote Seymour Papert a lot, who said, schools have the ability to teach 1/1000000000 of 1% of everything there is to know, and yet we argue forever about what that 1/1000000000 of 1/10 of 1% is.
The Common Core now.
Well, I look at the Common Core without going down into that rabbit hole too far, but I still think that it's just way too much curriculum. I mean, it's way too many things that I think are more nostalgic, more legacy, not really responding to the realities of the moment, and not really focused on helping kids become the learners that they need to be. It's still more about, have they learned these particular things? in these particular ways, and can they report back those learnings on this particular test? I'm just not sure that I'm not sure that's great for kids. I'm pretty sure that's not great for kids. I'm pretty sure it's not giving us the information that we need to make sure our kids are going to be successful as they grow into adulthood either.
That's a very provocative statement. I mean, you've really pushed this to the limit, that it's possible that schools are, as you said, emitting a dissonant signal between what is available outside the building and what is available inside.
Well, I think, but just briefly, because I want to make sure everyone else, obviously gets a chance to speak. But
they will.
I think that it's as simple as looking at our own learning and asking ourselves, how do we learn most deeply and most powerfully? And then asking, do those opportunities, do those conditions exist in school? And I think it's really difficult to make the case that the conditions that we have in our own lives when we are learning really deeply about the things we care about exist in classrooms. They simply don't. And to a large degree, they don't. And that's, I think, where that real dissonance and that real tension is going to continue to grow.
I think you guys can see why Will is such a great TED speaker. And let me recommend his book. But you raised a couple of huge points, and we just pick out one, which is that students, your kids, can, outside of school, build their own curriculum, find their own teachers, connect with whoever they want. But the Ithaca findings were that this is true of autodidacts, of self-driven learners, not of everybody. Rebecca, you wanted to chime in on this.
Yeah, I wanted to add, when we asked our faculty partners what scares them most about MOOCs, one of them said that she teaches in a metropolitan university that serves a lot of first-generation students from lower-income backgrounds, and her fear is that MOOCs represent yet another way that students who have come up through the kinds of educational systems that prepare them to be self-directed learners can continue to advance and can take advantage of this whole wealth of resources, whereas the students that she teaches don't know how to be self-directed learners, haven't learned to ask those questions and reach for the resources that are available on the internet. And so she designed her course around the MOOC as a vehicle for teaching them how to learn online, how to take advantage of these resources. And she's still sort of putting the thing in front of them and telling them, okay, this is what we're going to consume, but I think trying to move in the direction of helping them to feel empowered to take advantage of these kinds of resources themselves.
I think schools just really reduce freedom to learn, and so they take away that self-direction that I think kids have at a very, very young age. So, and the original MOOCs by Stephen Downes and George Siemens and Dave Cormier and all those other fine Canadians were all about helping people direct their own learning. They weren't curriculum-based. They really were about, here's the topic, here's the question, let's go in 1,000 different directions, and let's reflect on how we learned and how we kind of processed that learning. So I absolutely agree. I don't think kids are prepared to be self-directed learners, and I think that's one job that K through 12 has to take on, is how do we help kids develop the dispositions and the skills and the literacies that they need to really pursue that self-directed learning on their own.
We can take K through 12 and redefine it in part as preparation for the world of MOOCs. Let's hold on to that thought for a second, because we have half the panel, which is raring to go, and I want to introduce Deborah Howes as part of that. Deborah is Director of Digital Learning at MoMA. She oversees online courses, including MOOCs. So she is an expert here, a practitioner in other education initiatives. Previously, she was the Assistant Director and full-time faculty member of the online MA program in Museum Studies at Johns Hopkins. She has over 30 years of professional museum experience, including 13 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she oversaw the production of award-winning educational materials created for print, video, and web formats. Plus, somehow, on the side, 7 years at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she produced one of the museum's first computer-based multimedia projects. Deborah, welcome. And how do you see this from your environment?
Thank you, Bryan, for that very animated introduction. I really appreciate it. I do come from the perspective of museum learning, and it's really interesting hearing the first two speakers from the perspective of formal learning environments, because museums have always been there to help you guys be more like us, frankly. Because when people come to museums for help, whether they come online or they come on site, students, K through 12 or higher ed, they have questions they need answered. We have galleries that they can explore on their own. We're very much about the self-directed learner, which is not to say we don't have help for you if you don't have any direction. We certainly do. But I think the whole way museums have evolved, especially since the 60s and the progressive learning movement that blossomed at that time, and I'm so glad you quoted Seymour Papert. I love him. We've always provided, no matter the format, we've always provided an oasis for those kinds of learners. And I think that just to get to the nut here of what are the challenges, where's the competition, I really don't think from the museum environment we really find any competition when we engage in the online learning environment, but we see a lot of opportunities for collaborations and cross-disciplinary topics. And I just want to jump to maybe one example that could be food for a lot of others on this panel, which is that about a year and a half ago, MoMA joined Coursera, which, as I think everyone knows on the panel, is one of the larger MOOC providers, begun by two professors out of Stanford University. And they invited us to be part of this partnership because we had experience in both training teachers and making online courses. And and so we ended up making 2 MOOCs for K through 12 teachers, professional development. And the topics for those MOOCs were how to be better teachers using museum techniques. So informal learning, inquiry-based learning, activity-based learning, all the things that you actually don't learn when you're a museum educator. I mean, sorry, when you're a novice teacher in school, they don't really teach you these great techniques to make your learners more independent, to give them the skills of being driven on their own, by their own curiosity. And we were very interested to see that of the now 25,000 people who have enrolled in those courses, that really roughly half of them are teachers. The other half of them are not K through 12 teachers. They're academics, they're professionals, they're all sorts of other people who really want to have those skills too. And I think that there's a huge thirst here for communicating better overall, and I see a huge opportunity for museums and academics to collaborate together. When we started teaching our MOOCs, we got phone calls from the tech backend at Coursera saying, "What are you guys doing? Your engagement is so high. People are watching your entire video. You've got more people in your courses, like going from beginning to end." And we're like, we're just doing what we do. We're just teaching people how to be informal learners and informal learning facilitators. And I think there's a huge thirst out there. I think that museums have a lot to do together with academics about thinking what we're saying online, thinking how we're teaching online. There's a huge opportunity there.
Wow. Well, first, congratulations on blowing Coursera's mind. And that's what you'd expect from museums, I think. But I think it's interesting. You chime in with what the previous 2 panelists were saying. That I was really struck by that. We're teaching people how to be informal learners. I mean, that kind of chimes in with what Rebecca and was really saying with Will, the idea of schools teaching people not just content but how to learn. Maybe we're surfacing a model where we teach students how to be teachers. This is excellent, Deborah, and I'm in the interest of time, let me just hold on to that, celebrate what you just said, and let's complete the opening of this panel by bringing in our 4th, last but definitely not least, Cathy DeRosa. Cathy, before she joined OCLC in 2001, she was on the faculty of the Fisher School of Business in Ohio State University. As a University of Michigan alum, I will still be polite to Cathy. She taught e-business marketing from 1994 to 2000. She was a vice president at Cymex Systems. Prior to joining Cymex, she was a senior consultant with Price Waterhouse, serving technology companies in Boston and San Jose. Cathy, welcome. I hope you're nice and warm in Ohio.
It's been fascinating. It's nice to go last because I get to hear all the wisdom before. And I would say I would agree with about, maybe half of what my esteemed colleagues say today, and maybe I'll challenge a couple points. My purview or perspectives is from the library, and I'm part of a cooperative, and we serve libraries of all types. academic, public, community, business libraries around the world. And it's interesting because competition, I think, is always provides, sort of two sides to the coin. There's the things that make you stop and say, what am I great about? And things that make you stop and say, what perhaps should I stop doing? And this environment from a library perspective is really interesting. Libraries have always been about self-directed learning, of course, and exploration. So from that perspective, this is a real renaissance opportunity for libraries to really think about, what are those real values that we can bring in this new environment. So I think we could talk quite a bit about what those opportunities are. I think one of the challenges that we all face, and I think is most interesting, and we haven't really touched on it too much yet today, and that is what I would call the consumerization of education, or taking education and putting it into the same purview that we've seen happen with almost everything on the web, and that is to make it commercial. So we saw it with banking, we saw it with healthcare most recently, we've seen it with tourism, newspapers, et cetera, so forth. And I think one of the opportunities that we have and the challenges is when all of that comes to bear on education, what is that going to do? The ideas of choice and 24/7 access and not enrolling in school, but actually being promoted or invited to come to classes. And that whole realm, I think, is going to change the entire dynamics. I'm not sure that we'll be able to teach people how to learn online in this new environment as we may want to structure. Instead, I think we'll have to respond and get on board and swim in the same waves as those that are going to use all of those commercial efforts and exercises and tools to really bring education to the user. Because I think, as Rebecca mentioned very, very early on, it's not the traditional learner anymore that we're after, or that the world will start to really engage in new ways. It's these non-traditional learners, people like you and me at every level of every age. And I think that's going to be a really fun and interesting challenge for all of us to embrace, if you will, but be sure we understand. And so a lot of the research that I have been engaged in is really looking at the end user and thinking about it from more a consumer perspective.
Well, that's a terrific pair of perspectives you bring, Cathy, because you have the library view and you have the business consumerization point of view. Let me just, I'm so struck by everything. I don't know if you guys can tell, I'm busy typing away and writing all these notes. One that I just wanted to pull out among several is, I'm not sure we'll be able to teach people how to learn online. Now, for me, the libraries, especially public libraries, provide this unbelievably heroic role of providing access to the internet for everybody. No other entity on earth has that job, and it's just tremendous and really underappreciated. And it's access both in terms of infrastructure and hardware, but also human training, where people come in and librarians help people get online and do stuff. I mean, do you think that's just not fully there yet, or is that a capacity that libraries have the opportunity to develop?
Sure. I think, as you said, there's huge experience set there of what works and what doesn't. I think when I say we won't have the opportunity to teach them very specified classes or rules of how we're going to do self-directed learning, I think if we don't think about that in the perspective of what users are engaging with every day online, we're going to just not miss that opportunity. The context is so different now, right? So on my mobile phone, I get little blasts, little apps about how I should buy, how I should consume, how I should give ratings of courses. If I like this, I'll probably like this. And often, if you're like me, you click on that and down you go. So this environmental change about how we think about pushing information and engaging people and taking them down a path isn't necessarily teaching. I don't believe. It's more directional. And I think we have to think about that, whether we're libraries or teachers. How do we embrace those? Because we're not going to deny them. That's how we as users are going to perceive and use online learning of every type. How do we use that in a new way? And I think if we remove the teaching wrapper around it, instead say, how do we help navigate? How do we help them think about it? And in the context for which they are consuming everything else around them today, that's the perspective I think we have to have. or we'll miss the mark, I'm afraid.
So perhaps librarians are going to become like the old saw about teachers. You will become guides on the side. It fascinates me that if we've just now covered a huge swath of terrain where we've covered libraries, museums, K-12, and higher ed, and you all have a very, very different perspective, ranging from accommodation to even dire threat, and a lot of talk about opportunity and collaboration. I'm wondering if we could just dive in a little bit and flesh out some of these nuances. If we could speak to what online learning now looks like in both formal and informal learning spaces. I'm thinking about the learning management system, I'm thinking about MOOCs, I'm thinking about teaching with social media. I mean, where are you seeing this in your world? I mean, in K-12, and in fact, let's start off. Let's go back in. Let's reverse the order. Let's start off with libraries. Where are you seeing online? What does online learning look like from you? And then we'll work our way back through museums, K-12, and higher ed.
One of the areas that I've had the opportunity to do work in over the last decade is really to track what I've been calling the information consumer, or now the education consumer, and how they like to engage and learn online. And one of the things that we have discovered in our work is that if I allow the end user to define what their needs are and navigate their own way, they're going to find huge satisfaction. So I think from a library perspective and from a teaching perspective, if we stop thinking about online education as a set of modules sequenced together, but instead of mini gulps and mini if you will, micro courses or micro events or micro teaching moments, and begin to look at it that way and let the user string them together, I think we're going to find some interesting changes. So from a library perspective, that means, how do I provide small slices of information? How do I make that coexist with not courses, if you will, but events or activities or moments in time? And that's a very different perspective, but our research has said that's a pretty useful way for end users to actually do this self-directed learning that we've talked so much about this morning.
So a key thing for you is looking at how learners will prefer mini gulps, micro moments, small slices of information that they can then string together. I'm just putting in the chat box, and I'll copy this to Twitter, story from yesterday from Inside Higher Ed about how some Research One universities, I think we're looking at Duke and Harvard and MIT, are talking about redefining their offerings in terms of increased modularity. That might be of interest to you. Wow, what a major takeaway. That's very different from thinking of, say, the course model or the major or the degree. Deborah, what do you think? How are you seeing online learning in your view from the museum world?
Well, first off, I just want to validate what Cathy is saying, because we're finding, even though we started at MoMA with 10-week-long sort of traditionally organized courses, we're finding ourselves going much more in the similar direction of the thematic content developed with modules that can kind of grow organically together rather than, courses of probably too long a length than people can really commit to on an informal level. No one's getting grades for them, no one's getting credit for them. It's really pleasure learning, and the semester-long courses are sometimes just way too long. But I want to take a different approach just to flesh this issue out and talk about the audiences. So just to give you an example, like we have a huge range of audiences that our online courses serve. And we have seniors who meet once a month on Google Hangout all together synchronously to have their tour of MoMA, where images get thrown up on the screen, and they know each other now because they're the same group every month, and they have a very social, very rich, informal learning experience that means that many of these seniors that participate, they can't actually leave their apartment, or it's very difficult to do so. So they would never have an art experience otherwise. And I feel like that is a really important mission, especially for the informal learning environments like libraries and museums, to continue to do that, to make our collections accessible no matter where people are. So there's that physical element. And then we have sort of a middle ground where we have, like the MOOCs that I spoke about earlier, or even our online courses that are for fee, people pay fees for. We have this wonderful ability to create a learning community. So you're taking this course, And depending on the mode you select, you could also have access to the teacher and the students. You know, we teach people how to paint abstract expressionist style. They share each other's paintings and efforts in the studio. They talk about the exhibitions they've seen last week, about the trip they're planning to go see an exhibition next month. There's huge learning communities that actually persist beyond the end of the course. So we have 3 years worth of learning communities that have evolved out of this course, and they become very much attached to MoMA, both emotionally and kind of physically. You know, like they'll tell us what's going on in their world, and they'll give us advice, or they'll respond to issues that might be in the press, and they provide a lot of interesting feedback. This informal community that's kind of grown, and I continue to sort of feel like that in and of itself is maybe the best part of the online courses, if we can foster that kind of community building. Then maybe a third example maybe speaks to the K-12 audience a little bit better, which is that we have for years had an active online, after school, for years, an after school teen program, and it's really not about being a proficient draftsman or painter. It's really about how do you use art and artistic practice to explore important issues that are important to you as a teen. And a couple years ago, Calder's Wiki, my colleague at MoMA, really wanted to bring online courses into that mix as a tool. And so for 2 years now, we've allowed teens to build courses in our same courseware that we've used for years, but giving the challenge of teaching other teens around the world about what MoMA is about. And since these are teens that have taken our courses over the years, they're very familiar with the collection, they're familiar with our approach and the stories, but they created videos and content that none of us would ever thought of. And our second version just closed, and it was 250 teens all over the world talking and engaging with art and MoMA. It was a huge success, and also a good example of how the platforms of the MOOCs can be very malleable and very instructional for young learners to take control of their learning and to share it with others. I think peer-to-peer learning is one of the most important aspects that we can very effectively foster with online learning tools. And even in the graduate program I taught at Hopkins, we always emphasized on that peer-to-peer learning, mostly because it was a course about training museum professionals, and I think everyone on this panel probably knows that when you work in a nonprofit sector, there's nothing you do on your own. Everything is a group work. So we really wanted them to have that, but those peer-to-peer learning experiences were, I think, some of the most formative for my graduate students as well.
Wow, talking about so much material. My gosh, Deb, I mean, there's an awful lot there. I just wanted to mention 2 quick things to add to that. One is what you describe of students, teens making content. You remind me of some of the successes of the DS-106 MOOC or the Phonar MOOC, where MOOCs are based on what we'll refer to as the CMOOC point of view, which is constructivist and involves people actually making stuff. And the second, I just want to reiterate what you said about community. That ties in before what we were talking about with Rebecca's comments about students valuing their connections with teachers. Oh, so much there, Deborah. Let me just, in the interest of time, let me turn to Will and Rebecca and ask if you could say a bit more about what you're seeing. Since working backwards, Will, what are you seeing of the technology in the K-12 environment?
Well, I'll have a pretty quick answer to you. Not much. Especially in terms of online learning being anything different from checking a box in the curriculum and passing a certain assessment. I would say upwards of 95% of the online learning that kids do in the K through 12 level are basically just courses and coursework, nothing near to what Deborah just described, which I think is an amazing way of thinking about what we could be doing with kids right now. But again, you know, those kids are connected to their interests in art and then connected to one another around those interests, which makes for a much more stimulating environment in which to learn than one that says you have to take a physics course or an AP physics course if you want an AP physics course and it's not offered at this particular school, so you can take it online. I haven't seen much in the ways of any student agency or choice or autonomy that's developed within those spaces. So on the K through 12 level, I think technology is used in extremely traditional conservative ways, or to advance extremely traditional conservative ways of thinking about what learning and education look like. There's not a lot of use, again, to increase the freedom that kids have to learn about the things that they really care about. I think that, as I said before, I think that's a huge risk that, or schools see that as a huge risk and a huge challenge.
So if we were talking about K through 12 being potentially a way for teaching learners how to learn as kind of preparation for the world of MOOCs, it's not there at all.
And I think this is going to be ironic coming from someone who's got a site called Modern Learners, but I think we have to start dropping all the adjectives. Blended learning and deeper learning and informal learning and collaborative learning, and you can go on and on and on and on. I mean, at the end of the day, it's learning. And I think if we just focus on learners and focus on what it is that learners need in order to become better learners, I think we complicate it too much, or we have this fetish around modifying it for some reason.
That's actually my next question coming up. So hang on just for a second.
Sure.
Let's advance into colleges and universities. Rebecca, where are you seeing, what does online learning look now in formal, informal learning spaces in higher ed?
I think there's a lot of the same, I see a lot of the same things that Will sees, that the first wave of movement into online learning was kind of trying to replicate what the traditional classroom, the modes of the traditional classroom in an online environment. For most, if not all, degree programs where credit is awarded for courses, class sizes are required to be small, around 20 students, in order to make sure that the faculty and the students can have enough interaction. So it's really trying to replicate the same set of relationships in an online environment as much as possible. That said, there has been a real, I think, blossoming of interest over the last few years in trying to think about how to take greater advantage of the affordances of technology to create online learning spaces, to think differently about how students are learning to that education is about helping students to be able to do things and perform things, not to just learn names and dates. And so, as you know, Bryan, we're working with a set of liberal arts colleges who are trying to figure out what online learning looks like in upper-level humanities courses. And they're coming up with some really creative ideas for how the online community can be used to connect students with a wealth of digital resources that are available online that wouldn't naturally work in a traditional campus-based setting. So I think we're starting to see more creativity. This doesn't tend to help with the problem I identified earlier about doing more with less. These if anything, tend to do more with more. But I think first people have to get excited about the possibilities before I think anyone's going to be prepared to start thinking about where there are opportunities for efficiencies. We're just not really there yet.
I wonder if we're going to see really strong tension open up between, on the one hand, the necessity of doing more with less, and on the other hand, the idea of doing more with more. We're seeing many campuses running into severe resource constraints. Just last night was the shocking news that a Southern university had given up its football program, which I thought was a hanging offense in parts of the South, and they did it primarily for cost reasons. So we're in the second wave now. We've started off with the first wave where we copied and pasted traditional learning into the online environment. Now we're actually taking advantage of the affordances that it has available. We're also in the last 8 minutes of our panel. After this rich discussion, I hate to try and tie this off, but let me then ask all of you a question. If you could just take turns at this, I think it will tie some things together. We have the question of, what are the skills needed to succeed in this environment? What are the dispositions of people that are successful in this environment? And I'd like to ask you if you could each say a word about the dispositions of people who are learners and those who are teachers. What do we need for this? I'm responding in part to a question that came from the chat, which I think came from Twitter, which was, how will these new developments change faculty roles in the future? So I'm thinking for each of you, the museum practitioner, the librarian, the K through 12 teacher, the college professor, the college librarian, how does their role change in this environment? So why don't we lead off, and we can go back and forth again. Rebecca, do you want to jump on that?
Sure. I think that there's a lot of discussion about how the role of the faculty member is no longer so much to be the domain expert as it is, at least in the classroom setting, as it is to help students navigate their own instruction. And I think it's more about helping students to figure out what the questions are they need to ask, what are the important questions, and then how do you answer them? What resources do you need to bring to bear and pull together in order to answer them? And the performance aspect, the ability to accomplish certain types of tasks, as opposed to, do you know the answer to this question? I think everyone kind of understands now that being able to answer a question isn't going to get you very far, because anybody can go on Google and answer any question in 5 minutes. It's more knowing what the question is and where to go to find the right answers. That's important. So I think it's the characteristics of students who will succeed in this environment is curiosity, I think, being more inquiry-driven, and the characteristics of faculty who will thrive in this environment are people who are comfortable not just being the voice of authority and saying, I have the expertise in this domain, but helping students to figure out how to ask those questions.
It seems like what you just described in the faculty role is an update to what you described earlier of the valued faculty member who can really connect with students and help them learn. And here, this is them not just being the authority presence, the British literature figure, the biologist, but the one who helps them ask and answer questions. Deborah, how does this change in your world? What do you think becomes the ideal learner to succeed in your world?
I also wanted to say that Rebecca's point of view is exactly right from the museum point of view as well. Curiosity is huge. I think also the idea that teachers are becoming more connectors than subject experts, I think, is a really important concept. It works in a couple different ways. Like, for example, out of the MOOC world, we just completed a really interesting small experiment with the University of Maryland. Professor Porter there was teaching one of the largest MOOCs around, which is Introduction to Android Computing. And we met, and he was very interested in bringing art into that course, and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, you're teaching programming. What can I do for you? And he said, well, I think it's really important for the programmers to have a sense of design and possibility when they're thinking about programming their interfaces. So could you make a gallery of works that would be easy, would be inspirational for them to... And so we talked a little bit, and we made a gallery online in the MOOC environment of works of art that are what we call geometric abstraction, because that would be easy for the programmers to kind of copy, things like Pierre Mondrian and Ben Nicholson, things like that, Annie Albers, the Weaver. So we were really surprised to see how these students who had come to this course because they thought they were going to learn programming, turns out many hundreds of them were very inspired by looking at art while they're learning how to program, and came up with these fantastic interfaces. They were not expecting this, but we got a lot of positive feedback about, gee, that's so great, Professor Porter thought of to do this, and can we do this more? And then I would put in little responses from MoMA, maybe commenting on their designs, and just having that interaction between institutions, but also having that serendipity of finding art where they don't expect it was, I think, a really successful experiment.
And serendipity is the thing that the web is supposed to be bad at providing, right?
I don't find it bad at providing that, but
I agree. That's why I said it's supposed to be. But
yeah.
It sounds like you're describing one of the foundational dreams of hypertext, right? I mean, Vannevar Bush in 1945, as we may think, described our way of just leaping from topic to topic. Or, as Will said, this is the foundation, the first MOOC, Downs and Siemens MOOC about connectivism was following along those lines. So you're offering, I mean, that's a very, very different type of student. I mean, you were describing professionals, so students who then leap across these disciplines. Well, what do you think? K through 12 is bound up in many ways and deeply, deeply structured by disciplines, by social studies, by math, by language arts. I mean, do you see that the learners who succeed in this environment will have to think in those boxes or cross them? And teachers, will they also have to figure out how to cross these, or will they be bound up in these boxes?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a couple different questions in there, right? And I think that the first one is about, what are the dispositions that a teacher needs right now. I think a teacher has to see himself or herself as a learner first right now. I think that content expertise, while still important, is not now owned by the adult in the room. I mean, content expertise is everywhere. And in fact, there are probably smarter people outside of the classroom than there are inside of the classroom right now. So, teachers, I think, need to approach their role as the master learner in the classroom and to build a culture of learning that allows kids to make that the emphasis rather than, what's in the textbook or what's necessarily in the curriculum. I mean, this is for another day, but I think curriculum is a huge problem right now. I just think that there's way too much of it, that we teach a whole bunch of stuff just in case kids won't get it anywhere else, which is now not, the reality of the world. But that's kind of a whole different conversation to have. As for kids, look, I think schools just need to get out of the way. And kids come to schools with curiosity and with a desire to learn. And, there's a great book, his name escapes me, but it's called The More Beautiful Question, where he talks about in there how 4-year-olds ask an average of something like, I'm going to get the number wrong, but 4,000 questions a year or something, or a day or whatever it is. And by the time they get to be 12, they're asking 2. And what happens? Well, it's, I think, a lot of what schooling does to kids, which is to drive out curiosity, to kind of take away that agency, to really pigeonhole these disciplines into kids' learning lives in ways that make no sense, that have no real relevance outside of school at all. And so I think, when you talk about dispositions, let's just maintain the dispositions that kids bring to this whole learning thing, the inquiry piece of it, the curiosity piece of it, instead of subjecting them to a whole bunch of these kinds of different ways of thinking about learning that really don't make a lot of sense any longer. I think we just have to go back to the roots again, as I said before. It's about learning. Let's just focus on learning and understand how that works and how we can help create more opportunities to do that type of learning in classrooms.
So I'm detecting a pattern across what you've said, Will and Deborah and Rebecca, that you've really articulated the sense of students as free agents, knitting together, meeting based on their own inquiry, their own passion, their own curiosity. And that the faculty then had to change in an overwhelming way.
I think there is a big role for the teacher to play. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not suggesting that stuff happens without adults. I think adults have a huge role to play in that, but it's a different role from the one that they've been playing for the last 150 years.
You said schools have to get out of the way. You didn't say teachers.
Right.
That's a different thing.
That's right.
I think, Cathy, what do you add to this? I mean, how does the library world change? For you, what does the ideal learner look like? What does the ideal librarian look like?
I think from a learner, and I think Will has spoken quite eloquently about this, the learner is going to have to all of a sudden have new responsibilities that they have to put on themselves, because freedoms create opportunities, but they also create responsibilities. So if I'm going to be my self-directed learner, I'm going to have to be sure I take the responsibility of that as well. And what we've found in our surveys is students have actually liked that part of online learning, because it says, it really not only empowers me to choose what I want to do, but it also says, what, this is my responsibility and I've got to grab onto that. And that isn't as easy, as I just made it sound, of course, but I think that's, from a learner perspective, we have to realize that, choice requires also the opportunity for responsibilities, and we're going to learn that, and that'll be fun and interesting. I think from a librarian perspective or any learner, I just think that we should continue to remember and to emphasize the human side of it, that it's good to be the guide, but also be the human. We learn from engagement and conversation, and one of the lovely things, whether that's chat online or whether that's a face-to-face encounter with a librarian, is they love the expertise. I mean, one of the most interesting things about this panel for me today is I just love the emotion and the opinion. So as we're being guides on the sides and as we're being navigators, also be human and also bring your points of view to the table, because that will always be engaging, as great teachers have always been, right? We always have those great teacher experiences because they chose to really get engaged with us. So I think from a library perspective or anybody, both of those things, let's keep them in balance as we do this, because that's what creates fabulous learning and storytelling, and that's going to be our challenge, is to do both.
This is how we can tell we have had an extremely radical, dangerous, and threatening panel, because we've ended up by celebrating learning and being human. Clearly, this is a sign of dangerous radicalism. We've also radically gone over the technology. I have 5 minutes past the hour, and I had more questions for you, but after all, as we now know, we know each other, and this is what social media is for, and platforms like Twitter and the New Media Consortium can help us with that. Let me thank all four of you. Let me thank Deb, let me thank Cathy, let me thank Will, let me thank Rebecca for your patience, your energetic contributions, your cornucopia of ideas. This has been a delightful experience. We have conversation happening on Twitter, which we're going to have to jump in on, catch up with, but thank you all very, very much. Alex, over to you.
All right. Well, to wrap up today's webinar, I want to thank our moderator, Bryan, panelists Cathy, Deborah, Rebecca, and Will, on behalf of the NMC, for taking time to present their take on new models of learning. Participants, if you want to hear more about what you saw or heard today, let me know by contacting me directly at alex@nmc.org. To learn more about future NMC on the Horizon programs and get involved in our community, please visit our website that recently got refreshed, so I'd like for you to all take a look at that, at nmc.org. Like us on Facebook, friend us on Twitter at nmc.org, and stay tuned. We will soon be announcing the NMC on the Horizon lineup for early 2015. So until then, I will see you next year. Goodbye.